Hi, I'm Sherlock. Welcome to my new mystery case.
The yellow fog that clung to Baker Street that November evening was of such density that the gas lamps appeared as mere smudges of amber light in the murky gloom. In our sitting room at 221B, the fire crackled against the dampness, while Sherlock Holmes paced before the hearth with the restless energy of a caged predator. His long, angular frame cast dancing shadows on the wall as he moved, and I could see by the set of his shoulders that he was in one of his periods of enforced idleness, when the absence of stimulating cases left his remarkable mind to feed upon itself. He had spent the better part of the afternoon alternately staring out at the fog-shrouded street and attacking his violin with a series of discordant scrapes that seemed to mirror his mood. I had just settled into my chair with the evening paper when Holmes suddenly halted by the window, his hawk-like profile silhouetted against the glass. Without turning, he remarked that we would shortly receive a visitor, a gentleman of considerable means, judging by the quality of his boots, though one currently in a state of profound agitation that had caused him to forget his umbrella despite the inclement weather. Before I could question this pronouncement, the familiar sound of Mrs. Hudson's footsteps on the stairs announced an arrival, followed by the heavier tread of someone ascending with evident urgency. The door opened to admit a tall, distinguished gentleman of perhaps 50 years, his silver hair dishevelled, and his evening dress coat bearing the telltale dampness of the fog. His face was pale, his eyes wide with what I recognized as barely controlled terror, and his hands trembled as he removed his silk hat. Holmes gestured toward the chair opposite his own with that fluid grace that characterized his movements, and our visitor collapsed into it with evident relief. He introduced himself as Sir Edmund Blackwood, a name I knew belonged to one of London's most prominent financiers. His voice, when he began to speak, carried the cultivated tones of a man accustomed to command, though it trembled now with an emotion that seemed to war between disbelief and desperate hope. What had brought him to our door at such an hour, he explained, was an occurrence so extraordinary that he had hesitated to report it to the authorities for fear of being thought mad. Sir Edmund's account began with events of the previous evening. His business partner and dearest friend, Mr. Harold Pemberton, had been found dead in his study at his Mayfair residence at 6 o'clock, the victim of what appeared to be a sudden cardiac arrest. The household physician, Dr. Morris, had certified the death and estimated that it had occurred sometime between 5 and 5:30 that afternoon. The body had been left undisturbed in the locked study, with Dr. Morris retaining the only key until the undertaker could arrive. Here Sir Edmund paused, his knuckles white as he gripped the arms of his chair. What followed, he said, defied all rational explanation. At precisely 7:30 that evening, he had received a telephone call at his own residence. The voice on the other end had been unmistakably that of Harold Pemberton, speaking in his characteristic measured tones about certain confidential financial documents that required immediate attention. They had arranged to meet the following morning, and the conversation had ended with Pemberton's customary farewell. Holmes, who had been listening with his eyes half closed in an attitude of complete attention, now leaned forward with sudden interest. He pressed Sir Edmund for every detail of the conversation, the exact words used, the quality of the voice, any peculiarities in the manner of speech. Our visitor struggled to recall the specifics through his evident distress, but he remained certain of the essential facts. The voice had been Pemberton's without question, discussing matters known only to the two partners. The call had come through clearly, lasting nearly 5 minutes. The impossibility of the situation was stark and undeniable. Harold Pemberton had been dead for at least 2 hours, when he had apparently lifted a telephone receiver and conducted a business conversation with his partner. Holmes's grey eyes had taken on that peculiar glitter that I knew indicated his mind had seized upon something of profound interest. He asked Sir Edmund to repeat the exact time of the call, and when our visitor confirmed it had been precisely 7:30, marked by the chiming of his mantel clock, Holmes's thin lips curved into that enigmatic smile that suggested he had already perceived patterns invisible to lesser minds. Rising from his chair with characteristic abruptness, Holmes moved to the window and stared out into the fog-bound street. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of satisfaction that I had not heard in weeks. He informed Sir Edmund that the case presented features of unusual interest, and that we would call upon him the following morning to examine the scene more thoroughly. As our visitor departed into the murky night, Holmes turned to me with eyes bright with anticipation, remarking that after a tedious week of mundane affairs, London had finally provided us with a puzzle worthy of our attention. The yellow fog had lifted considerably by morning, though a grey pall still hung over the rooftops of London as Holmes and I prepared to depart for Mayfair. Over a hasty breakfast, my companion had been unusually talkative, outlining what he termed the 4 fixed points of our investigation: Pemberton's undisputed death, the doctor's estimate of time, the telephone connection, and Sir Edmund's recognition of the voice. Between these points, he declared with evident satisfaction, lay our path to the truth. "You observed last evening, Watson," said he, buttering his toast with mechanical precision, "that our visitor removed his gloves only after he was seated, and that the left clung damply to his fingers while the right came away clean. He had clutched something wet during his journey to us, most likely the handle of a cab door in his agitated state. The absence of his customary umbrella in such weather speaks to a mind profoundly disturbed. We are dealing with a man whose orderly world has been shattered by an impossibility." During our handsome ride through the gradually clearing streets, Holmes fell into that peculiar abstraction I knew so well, his sharp profile silhouetted against the window as his mind arranged and rearranged the facts before us. Only, as we approached the fashionable squares of Mayfair, did he rouse himself to observe that we approached this case not through the corpse, but through a voice that should no longer exist. The Pemberton residence stood among its neighbours with quiet dignity, its Portland stone facade gleaming dully in the weak November sunlight. Sir Edmund awaited us in the entrance hall, looking even more haggard than he had the previous evening. The sleepless night had carved deeper shadows beneath his eyes, and his hands trembled slightly as he greeted us. Beside him stood a short, stout gentleman with a bristling moustache and an air of professional indignation, whom he introduced as Dr. Morris. The physician regarded us with evident scepticism, his chest puffed with wounded dignity. Before we had even crossed the threshold, he declared that his certification of death was absolute, and that any suggestion of error was an affront to his 40 years of medical practice. Holmes received this pronouncement with that thin smile which I knew indicated his mind was already several steps ahead of the speaker. Dr. Morose himself produced the heavy brass key that unlocked the study door, the room having remained sealed since the discovery of the body. The chamber beyond was everything one might expect of a successful financier's private sanctum. Mahogany bookshelves absorbed the dim light filtering through heavy velvet curtains, creating an atmosphere of oppressive stillness. Behind a sprawling oak desk sat the mortal remains of Harold Pemberton, slumped forward in his leather armchair in an attitude of unnatural repose. Holmes moved immediately to the body, his magnifying glass appearing in his hand with practiced swiftness. His examination was thorough and clinical, focusing particularly on the hands, face, and the general positioning of the limbs. After several minutes of silent scrutiny, he straightened and confirmed Dr. Morouse's assessment. Rigor mortis was well advanced, the body temperature consistent with death having occurred the previous afternoon, certainly no later than 5:30. This only served to deepen our mystery, solidifying the impossibility of a telephone call made 2 hours post-mortem. Turning from the corpse, Holmes began a systematic examination of the study itself. The tall windows were latched and painted shut, clearly unopened for years. The heavy door showed no signs of tampering, its lock and hinges sound. The narrow chimney was barred by an iron grate, undisturbed by any accumulation of soot. To all appearances, the room had been hermetically sealed from the moment Dr. Morris turned the key. Finally, Holmes approached the telephone, a standard pedestal model standing on the left side of the desk. Rather than touching the instrument immediately, he bent low, bringing his face within inches of its base. His eyes narrowed as he examined the polished oak surface beneath it, and I saw him beckon me closer. There, barely visible against the dark grain, was a faint, semicircular scratch, as if the heavy instrument had been dragged or twisted from its original position. With infinite care, Holmes lifted the receiver using his handkerchief, holding it up to the light. He traced the fabric-covered wire down to where it disappeared into the skirting board, his nose wrinkling slightly, as if detecting some scent out of place in the stale air. Then, producing his lens once more, he directed my attention to a small, almost imperceptible smudge of white powder on the black surface of the receiver's ear cup. Holmes straightened, his eyes gleaming with that fierce intelligence I knew so well. "While the dead do not speak, Watson," he murmured with evident satisfaction, "they occasionally leave behind the means by which others may speak for them." The gleam in his grey eyes told me that the impossible voice from beyond the grave had begun to yield its secrets to his relentless logic, before either Sir Edmund or Dr. Morris could press him for an explanation of his cryptic observation. Holmes had produced a small vellum envelope from his waistcoat pocket and, with the delicate precision of a surgeon, scraped the minute sample of white powder from the telephone receiver into it. He sealed the packet with a decisive motion, his grey eyes gleaming with satisfaction as he noted aloud that such a substance, however insignificant it might appear to the untrained observer, suggested the instrument had been handled by someone whose personal habits differed markedly from those of the deceased. Dr. Morris bristled at this implicit criticism of his examination, but Holmes had already turned his attention to the mechanics of the telephone itself. He traced the fabric-covered wire from the instrument across the desk to where it disappeared through the heavy oak wainscoting. Lying flat upon the dusty carpet with his magnifying glass, he observed that the dust around the aperture had been disturbed, creating a ring of lighter wood where the wire had been pulled to its utmost limit before being returned to its original position. This physical evidence confirmed his earlier suspicion that the telephone had been deliberately moved during the previous evening. Rising and brushing the dust from his knees, Holmes dismissed Dr. Morris with a curt nod, suggesting that while his medical expertise regarding the corpse was invaluable, the telephonic anomaly required a different sort of investigation entirely. As the physician departed, still muttering about irregular procedures, Holmes rang for the household staff to be assembled. It was time, he declared to me in a low voice, to examine the living, for a phantom voice invariably required earthly assistance to manifest itself through the telephone network. The butler who answered our summons was a grave man named Staunton, whose 3 decades of faithful service to the Pemberton family showed in every measured gesture. Standing before the desk with his eyes carefully averted from his late master's form, he responded to Holmes's rapid questions with deliberate precision. Mr. Pemberton had retired to his study at 4 o'clock the previous afternoon after a light luncheon, giving strict instructions that he was not to be disturbed under any circumstances. Staunton himself had been occupied in the pantry polishing silver, while the footman had been dispatched on an errand to the post office. Holmes pressed for details regarding the other occupants of the house during those critical hours, and here Staunton's composure faltered slightly. He admitted with evident reluctance that Mr. Pemberton's nephew Julian had been in residence, as had Mr. Silas Vance, the deceased's personal secretary. Both men had been present during the time between death and discovery. Young Julian had claimed to be practicing billiards in the game room, while Mr. Vance had been working in the small library that adjoined the study. The footman, when summoned, provided a detail that caused Holmes's eyes to narrow with interest. Thomas Wickham, an earnest young man of perhaps 25, admitted that upon returning from his errand at 5 o'clock, he had found the front door standing slightly ajar. The discovery had struck him as peculiar given the November chill, but he had simply closed and bolted it properly, assuming someone had been careless. When Holmes inquired why he had mentioned this to no one, Wickham coloured and stammered that he had not wished to trouble the household with what seemed a minor oversight. Sir Edmund interjected sharply at this revelation, demanding to know if the footman was suggesting an intruder had entered while Mr. Pemberton lay dying. Holmes raised a hand to silence the growing agitation, his manner remaining coolly analytical as he filed away this significant detail. Holmes next requested the presence of Mr. Silas Vance, and presently a slender, pale young man with ink-stained fingers and nervous spectacles entered the study. The secretary appeared genuinely shaken, his eyes darting between the shrouded form of his employer and Holmes's penetrating gaze. Under questioning, he confirmed that he had been sorting correspondence in the adjacent library from 4 until 6 o'clock. The walls were thick, he insisted, and he had heard nothing unusual from the study, no cry of distress, no fall, and certainly no voice speaking into the telephone. However, as Vance spoke, I observed Holmes's attention fixed not upon the young man's face, but upon his clothing. There, on the left cuff of his dark jacket, was a faint but distinct chalky smudge that seemed to fascinate my friend entirely. Holmes asked abruptly about the nature of the correspondence Vance had been organizing, and the secretary flushed deeply, stammering that it concerned the very financial merger that had been the subject of the impossible telephone call. When Holmes dismissed Vance and called for the nephew, Julian Pemberton proved a striking contrast to the nervous secretary. A loud, blustering young man with the flushed complexion of intemperance, he entered the death chamber with defensive arrogance, carrying the distinct aroma of brandy and stale tobacco. He made no attempt to conceal his estrangement from his uncle, admitting freely that they had quarrelled earlier in the week regarding his allowance. When pressed about his whereabouts that afternoon, Julian claimed to have been alone in the billiard room, practicing difficult shots for over 2 hours. Holmes listened to this account with polite skepticism, his keen eyes scanning the young man's waistcoat and hands. He inquired casually about Julian's success with his billiards practice, to which the nephew replied with obvious irritation that he had been decidedly off his game. It was then that Holmes made what seemed an innocuous observation about the quality of billiard chalk used in the house, a remark that caused Julian to frown in evident confusion before storming from the room in a cloud of hostility. As the nephew's footsteps faded down the corridor, Holmes turned to me with barely suppressed excitement. "The circle was tightening," he whispered, "for while we had a locked room and a dead man, we also had 2 individuals who stood to gain or lose fortunes based upon the completion of the business discussed in that phantom telephone call. One possessed intimate knowledge of the financial arrangements, the other harbored desperate need for money. The physical evidence, the white powder, and the disturbed wire would ultimately connect the impossible to the inevitable." He beckoned toward the door, declaring that our next examination must be of the library where Mr. Vance had spent his afternoon, for he suspected the walls of this house were not nearly as soundproof as the secretary would have us believe. The library adjoining the study proved to be a cramped chamber that had clearly served as Mr. Vance's domain during his afternoon of supposed correspondence sorting. The room bore the distinctive marks of scholarly disorder, with papers scattered across a small writing desk, and the lingering scent of cheap ink hanging in the stale air. Holmes moved immediately to the wall that separated this space from the study, his keen eyes scanning the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves with predatory intensity. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, running his fingers along the edge of one particular shelf, "how the dust patterns here differ markedly from those elsewhere. These volumes have been disturbed recently, and not for purposes of literary consultation." Without hesitation, he began removing heavy leather-bound tomes from a section that stood directly opposite the position of Pemberton's desk in the adjacent room. As each book was lifted away, a small shower of white powder drifted down onto the dark carpet below. As the gap in the shelving widened, the true nature of our mystery began to reveal itself. There, roughly bored through the lath and plaster of the wall, gaped a hole perhaps an inch in diameter. The edges were fresh, showing the bright white of newly exposed plaster that matched exactly the powder Holmes had collected from the telephone receiver. Through this crude aperture, I could see the fabric-covered telephone wire from the study, which had been pulled taut and stripped of its insulation to reveal the copper conductors beneath. Holmes produced his lens and examined the makeshift installation with evident fascination. A secondary telephone receiver, clearly salvaged from another instrument, had been connected to the exposed wires with twisted copper joins that spoke of hasty but competent work. The entire apparatus was concealed behind the books, invisible to casual inspection, yet perfectly positioned to intercept or transmit calls through Pemberton's line. "The mechanics of our phantom voice are now laid bare," Holmes declared with satisfaction. "Someone sat in this very spot yesterday evening, speaking through this purloined receiver, while the corpse grew cold mere feet away." The pulling force that dragged the study telephone across the desk was simply the result of fishing the wire through this opening to make the necessary connections. I marveled at the ingenuity of the deception, yet found myself troubled by its implications. But Holmes, who among the household possesses both the technical knowledge to accomplish such work and the intimate familiarity with Pemberton's voice and business affairs necessary to deceive Sir Edmund. Before he could respond, Holmes had moved to examine the writing desk more closely. Among Vance's scattered correspondence, he discovered a small wooden box containing several pieces of billiard chalk, their edges worn smooth from recent use. The chalky residue on his handkerchief matched the substance perfectly, confirming that whoever had handled the telephone receiver had also been in contact with these materials. "The secretary's domain yields billiard chalk," Holmes observed, "yet we know from the butler that Julian Pemberton spent his afternoon in the billiard room. Either Mr. Vance has been practicing his shots at this desk, or someone has been moving freely between the various chambers of this house." He pocketed one of the chalk pieces, then turned his attention to the fireplace, where the remnants of a recent fire smouldered among the ashes. Using the fire tongs with delicate precision, Holmes extracted a partially burned fragment of paper that had escaped complete destruction. The scrap bore only a few words in a cramped, precise hand. "Ensure the transfer is completed before—" The remainder had been consumed by the flames, but the handwriting was unmistakably that of a practiced clerk. "Mr. Vance's penmanship," Holmes noted grimly, discussing transfers that bear a striking resemblance to the business supposedly conducted in our phantom telephone call. "Yet we also have this." From the carpet near the skirting board, he retrieved the crushed end of a cigarette of distinctly Turkish tobacco, its aroma matching exactly the scent I had detected on Julian Pemberton's clothing. The evidence was mounting, yet it pointed in contradictory directions. The technical apparatus suggested someone with access to tools and electrical knowledge, while the burned document implied premeditation by the secretary. The Turkish cigarette placed the nephew at the scene, yet the billiard chalk connected him to Vance's desk. Holmes straightened, his brow furrowed with the complexity of the puzzle before us. "We have the means clearly established," he declared, gesturing toward the wiretapping apparatus. "But the human element presents us with a surfeit of suspects rather than a shortage. Both Julian Pemberton and Silas Vance had motive, opportunity, and physical evidence connecting them to this deception. Are we to believe they acted in concert, despite their obvious mutual antipathy?" At that moment, Sir Edmund appeared in the doorway, his face ashen with fresh alarm. In his trembling hand he clutched a telegram, its yellow paper bearing the urgent markings of the Central Telegraph Office. "Mr. Holmes," he gasped, "I have just received word from the bank. The financial transfer discussed in that impossible telephone call has been initiated using an authorization code that expired 3 years ago. The code was based on Pemberton's late wife's birth date, known only to the original partners, and—" Holmes's eyes blazed with sudden understanding. "And to anyone who might have access to the old partnership documents," he finished. "The deception was never intended to succeed at the bank, Sir Edmund. It was designed to flush out someone else entirely, someone who would recognize that obsolete code and understand its significance." He snatched his hat from the desk with characteristic abruptness. "Come, Watson, we have been examining the mechanics of deception when we should have been studying its psychology. The true target of this elaborate charade was not Sir Edmund's credulity, but someone else's memory. Our phantom caller has revealed more than he intended, and the game is now afoot in earnest." As we prepared to leave the library, Holmes cast one final glance at the crude, wiretapping apparatus behind the books. The technical skill required for its installation, combined with the intimate knowledge of Pemberton's business affairs and personal habits necessary for the impersonation, had narrowed our field of suspects considerably. Yet the contradictory evidence suggested a complexity to this case that even Holmes's remarkable deductive powers would be tested to unravel completely. Our departure from the Pemberton residence found Holmes in a state of barely contained excitement, his keen mind clearly racing through the implications of our discoveries. The crude wiretapping apparatus behind the library books had revealed the mechanics of the deception, yet the human element remained tantalizingly elusive. As our hansom clattered through the fog-shrouded streets toward the city, Holmes sat forward with that predatory intensity I knew signaled his complete absorption in the puzzle before us. "The obsolete authorization code changes everything, Watson," he declared, his grey eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "Our phantom caller possesses intimate knowledge of the firm's early operations, yet lacks current familiarity with their procedures. We are seeking someone whose understanding of Pemberton's business affairs is frozen in time, specifically to a period 3 years past when that cipher was still in use." Sir Edmund, who had accompanied us in evident distress, protested that only the original partners and their late wives had known that particular code. Holmes's thin smile suggested he had anticipated this objection. "Then we must examine who might have had access to the historical records where such information would be preserved. The offices of Blackwood and Pemberton will yield our next clues, I am certain." The firm's premises in Threadneedle Street presented the solid facade of established respectability, with clerks moving about their duties behind high mahogany desks. Sir Edmund's arrival created a subdued stir, quickly suppressed when the staff observed my companion's penetrating gaze surveying their domain. Holmes immediately requested access to the earliest partnership ledgers and employment records, declaring that the solution to our mystery lay buried in the firm's own history. While we awaited the documents, Holmes questioned Sir Edmund regarding the senior staff. There was one man whose tenure stretched back to the very founding of the enterprise, Mr. Archibald Fenton, the chief cashier, who had joined as a boy clerk when the firm first opened its doors. His 40 years of unblemished service had made him privy to every detail of the partnership's evolution, including the various codes and ciphers employed over the decades. When the records arrived, Holmes attacked them with characteristic intensity, his long fingers tracing the faded entries with practiced speed. His attention fixed upon a particular notation in Fenton's precise handwriting, documenting the obsolete authorization code alongside a marginal note indicating its supersession following Mrs. Pemberton's death. "Here is our connection, Watson," he murmured with evident satisfaction. "The very code used in last night's deception, recorded in the hand of the one man who would remember its significance." Mr. Fenton himself soon appeared, a spare, grey-headed gentleman whose lined face bore the marks of 4 decades spent in meticulous service. His pale eyes showed genuine grief at mention of his late employer, yet Holmes watched him with the intensity of a hawk observing potential prey. When questioned about the obsolete code, Fenton acknowledged his familiarity with it but maintained his absolute integrity with quiet dignity. Holmes pressed further, learning that Fenton had left the office on a routine errand yesterday afternoon, carrying securities to their brokers in Throgmorton Street. The timing was significant. He had departed at 4:30 and returned shortly after 5, precisely during the window, when Pemberton lay dying in his study. More intriguing still, the errand had been arranged by Silas Vance, who had brought the authorization from Pemberton's house that very morning. As Fenton withdrew, Holmes remained silent for several minutes, his steepled fingers indicating deep contemplation. "The pattern begins to emerge, Watson," he said at length. "Someone has calculated upon Fenton's memory as upon a mathematical certainty. The choice of that obsolete code was deliberate, designed not merely to deceive Sir Edmund, but to ensure that when the fraud was discovered, suspicion would naturally fall upon the one man who might remember such ancient details." Returning to the Pemberton residence as afternoon shadows lengthened, Holmes conducted a final examination of the physical evidence. In the library he retrieved the crushed cigarette end I had observed earlier, subjecting it to intense scrutiny with his magnifying glass. His expression grew increasingly thoughtful as he compared its characteristics to the fresh specimens we had observed Julian Pemberton smoking in the billiard room. "Observe the tobacco, Watson," he said, holding the stub to the light. "This is Turkish leaf, distinctively aromatic and expensive. Yet young Julian smokes only Egyptian cigarettes, a different blend entirely. Someone has deliberately planted this evidence to implicate him, just as the obsolete code was chosen to cast suspicion upon Fenton. The implications were staggering. We faced not merely a case of impersonation and fraud, but an elaborate scheme of misdirection designed to destroy multiple reputations simultaneously. Holmes's eyes blazed with the fierce joy of intellectual combat as he contemplated the intricate web of deception surrounding us. The phantom voice from beyond the grave was proving to be the product of a mind both technically proficient and psychologically sophisticated, one that understood not only the mechanics of telephonic communication, but the deeper currents of human suspicion and guilt. "Come, Watson," he declared, striding toward the door with renewed purpose. "We have identified the methods and examined the misdirection. Now we must determine who possesses both the technical skill to execute such a deception and the intimate knowledge necessary to orchestrate it with such precision. The game, as they say, is afoot in earnest." Holmes did not immediately depart, as his energetic declaration might have suggested. Instead, he paused in the corridor outside the library, his keen eyes scanning the floor with renewed intensity. The faint trail of white powder that had led us to the wiretapping apparatus continued beyond the library, creating an almost imperceptible path along the skirting board toward the servants' quarters below. "The evidence multiplies, Watson," he murmured, following the ghostly trace with his magnifying glass, "yet it multiplies in a manner that suggests deliberate orchestration rather than natural accumulation. Our artificer has been careless with his materials, or perhaps too careful in his misdirection." We descended to the cellar through the narrow servants' stair, Holmes's lantern casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. In a corner near the coal bunker, concealed behind stacked crates, we discovered a wooden box containing the tools of our phantom's trade: insulated wire, a cracked telephone mouthpiece, a small hand drill still dusted with fresh plaster fragments. Most significantly, the delivery label on the crate bore not the Pemberton address, but rather the offices of Blackwood and Pemberton, consigned to 1S Vance. "Purchased through legitimate channels," Holmes observed with satisfaction, "yet delivered to the firm rather than the residence. Our secretary has been more cunning than we initially credited, though not cunning enough to avoid leaving this particular trail." Returning to the study, Holmes subjected our collected samples to more rigorous chemical analysis using a portable testing kit he had retrieved from his coat. The results proved illuminating in ways I had not anticipated. The white powder from the telephone receiver contained not only plaster dust but traces of a cosmetic preparation, specifically a face powder containing rice starch and zinc oxide. The billiard chalk, by contrast, showed the pure calcium carbonate composition of commercial manufacture. Two different substances, Watson, though superficially similar. The genuine residue from our wiretapper's work bears the unmistakable signature of someone who uses facial cosmetics, while the chalk, planted to implicate Julian Pemberton, is precisely what it appears to be. We are dealing with a mind sophisticated enough to create false evidence while leaving genuine traces of the actual perpetrator. As if summoned by our discoveries, Staunton appeared with word that a young woman had arrived at the kitchen entrance, requesting urgent audience with Mr. Vance. Her distressed condition and refusal to provide her name had prompted the butler's discretion in bringing the matter to our attention rather than the secretary's. The girl who was presently admitted to the study proved to be Miss Mary Sutherland, a pale, frightened creature of perhaps 20 years, who worked as a typist at a nearby solicitor's office. Through her tears, she revealed herself as Silas Vance's secret fiancée, engaged to him for 3 months past. What brought her to us, however, was a discovery that cast our entire investigation in a new light. From her reticule, she produced a leather-bound notebook filled with technical diagrams and electrical schematics. Holmes seized it with barely contained excitement, his eyes devouring the detailed plans for wire-tapping apparatus that matched exactly what we had discovered behind the library books. Yet the notebook contained far more than mere technical drawings. Alongside the schematics were careful studies of the household's routines, detailed maps of the firm's offices, and even sketches of Julian Pemberton's daily movements. "These preparations extend back 6 months, Watson," Holmes declared, examining the dated entries. "This was no crime of sudden opportunity, but a long-planned campaign awaiting its perfect moment. Yet observe the handwriting carefully. Indeed, while the personal entries were in Vance's familiar cramped script, the technical annotations were written in a bold, confident hand that spoke of engineering expertise far beyond a secretary's capabilities. Miss Sutherland, when pressed, admitted that Vance had spoken of a collaborator he referred to only as the Professor, a man of scientific genius who had been wronged by the academic establishment and sought revenge through unconventional means. "They would meet late at night," she whispered, "and Silas would return excited but frightened, speaking of grand plans and terrible risks. He told me it was an invention that would revolutionize communication, but I began to suspect something darker. Holmes closed the notebook with decisive satisfaction. We have our conspiracy at last, Watson. Vance provides the access and inside knowledge, while his mysterious professor supplies the technical expertise and, I suspect, the murderous intent. Yet one question remains. Where did these clandestine meetings take place? He moved to examine the architectural plans of the house, which Staunton had produced from the estate office. His finger traced the walls with particular attention to the party wall between the Pemberton residence and the neighbouring property. "Just as I suspected," he announced. "The wall here is unusually thin due to chimney modifications made years ago, and the house next door, Watson, has stood vacant for precisely 6 months." The implication struck me with sudden clarity. While we had been examining the internal mechanics of the deception, the true source of the phantom voice had been operating from the adjacent property. The wiretapping apparatus in the library was merely a relay point connecting Pemberton's telephone to a more sophisticated installation next door. "Tonight, Watson, we shall pay our neighbours an unexpected visit," Holmes declared, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. "I suspect we shall find that vacant house considerably less empty than the letting agents believe. Our professor has been closer than we imagined, separated from his victim by nothing more than a few inches of Victorian masonry." As evening shadows lengthened across Mayfair, Holmes's excitement was palpable. The phantom voice that had seemed so supernatural was revealing itself as the product of human cunning and technical expertise. Yet the true motives behind this elaborate deception remained tantalizingly beyond our grasp, awaiting discovery in the darkened rooms of the house next door. The November fog had thickened to an impenetrable wall by the time Holmes and I made our approach to the vacant property adjoining the Pemberton residence. Holmes had insisted we wait until the deepest hours of night, when even the most dedicated constable would be seeking shelter from the penetrating damp. He had exchanged his usual attire for a rough pea jacket and dark cap, while I carried my service revolver loaded and ready beneath my coat. The gravity of his preparation suggested we were about to confront a mind both brilliant and utterly ruthless. Access to the rear of the property proved surprisingly simple, the garden wall offering little resistance to 2 determined men. Holmes produced his lockpicks with practiced efficiency, and within moments we had gained entrance through the scullery window. The interior greeted us with the musty scent of abandonment, yet Holmes's keen eye immediately detected the telltale signs of recent habitation: a narrow path worn through the dust, fresh scratches on door frames, and the faint but unmistakable odour of electrical apparatus. We ascended to the first floor with infinite caution, our footsteps muffled by the thick Persian carpets that had been left behind by the previous occupants. The room corresponding to Pemberton's study had been transformed into a workshop of remarkable sophistication. Holmes's dark lantern revealed an array of batteries, coils, and switching mechanisms that spoke of considerable electrical expertise. At the centre of this installation stood a telephone instrument of unusual design, its multiple receivers and speaking tubes suggesting capabilities far beyond ordinary domestic equipment. "Behold our phantom's true voice, Watson," Holmes whispered, his excitement barely contained despite our precarious situation. This apparatus could intercept, record, and retransmit telephone conversations with remarkable fidelity. Our professor has created nothing less than a complete telephonic theatre. The wall adjoining the Pemberton study showed evidence of the same careful boring we had discovered in the library, though here the aperture was larger and more professionally executed. Multiple wires snaked through the opening, creating a direct connection that would allow complete control over Pemberton's telephone line. Holmes traced the connections with his magnifying glass, noting the precision of the electrical joints and the quality of the insulation. Among the equipment, we discovered a series of wax cylinders arranged beside a phonograph of advanced design. Holmes selected one at random and, after ensuring the sound would not carry beyond the room, activated the machine. The voice that emerged sent a chill through my bones, for it was unmistakably that of Harold Pemberton, discussing routine business matters in his characteristic, measured tones. The recording had been made with such clarity that even intimate knowledge of the deceased would not have detected the mechanical reproduction. "Practice sessions, Watson," Holmes declared grimly. "Our adversary has been recording Pemberton's voice during legitimate conversations, studying every inflection and mannerism until he could reproduce them with perfect accuracy." The phantom call to Sir Edmund was not improvised but carefully rehearsed. Scattered among the technical apparatus, Holmes discovered correspondence that shed brilliant light upon our mystery. The letters, addressed to one Professor Edmund Morstan, revealed a man of considerable scientific achievement who had been dismissed from the Royal Institution under circumstances involving accusations of fraudulent research. The dismissal had been championed by none other than Harold Pemberton, who had served on the disciplinary committee and provided the decisive testimony that destroyed Morstan's academic career. "Revenge, Watson," Holmes murmured, examining the bitter exchanges. "Not mere financial gain, but the systematic destruction of a man's reputation and livelihood. Pemberton's death was merely the opening movement in a larger symphony of vengeance designed to discredit everyone associated with his business empire." The final letter in the collection, dated only 3 days prior, contained instructions that made my blood run cold. Morstan had ordered the elimination of all witnesses once the financial transfer was completed, beginning with Silas Vance and extending to anyone who might connect the conspiracy to its architect. The secretary's usefulness was at an end, and his survival had become a liability that could not be tolerated. Holmes pocketed the most damaging correspondence with swift precision, then began examining the room for additional evidence of Morstan's presence. He discovered a travelling case containing personal effects and noted that the camp bed in the corner showed signs of recent use. Our quarry was not merely using this house as a workshop but as a temporary residence, suggesting he planned to remain in London long enough to complete his campaign of destruction. The sound of a key turning in the front door lock froze us both in absolute stillness. Heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway below, ascending the stairs with confident, measured tread. Holmes extinguished his lantern and drew me into the shadows behind a tall cabinet, his hand resting on the grip of his own revolver. Through the darkness we could hear the approaching footsteps pause outside our door, and the soft scrape of a key being inserted into the lock. Professor Edmund Morstan had returned to his lair, and with him came the final, deadly confrontation that would determine whether justice or vengeance would triumph in this most extraordinary case. The door swung open with deliberate precision, admitting a tall, gaunt figure whose silhouette against the hallway's gaslight revealed a man of formidable presence, despite his evident years. Professor Edmund Morstan entered with the measured tread of one intimately familiar with his surroundings, carrying a leather dispatch case in one hand and a walking stick whose silver head gleamed ominously in the dim light. He moved directly to his electrical apparatus without bothering to illuminate the room further, his long fingers dancing across the complex array of switches and dials with the practiced ease of a concert pianist. Holmes and I remained frozen in our concealment as Morstan began his preparations, the faint glow from the battery indicators providing just enough light to reveal a face marked by bitter intelligence. His sharp features bore the unmistakable stamp of academic distinction, yet years of nursing grievances had twisted his expression into something cold and calculating. When he spoke, it was to himself in the cultured tones of a man accustomed to lecturing halls, though his words carried a poison that no university would have tolerated. "The final performance approaches," he murmured, adjusting a series of copper contacts with surgical precision. "Young Vance has served his purpose admirably, though the fool believes himself a partner rather than a mere instrument. Tomorrow's revelation will correct that misapprehension permanently." From his dispatch case, he withdrew a small vial containing colorless liquid, holding it up to examine its contents with evident satisfaction. Aconitine, so difficult to detect in a body already compromised by nervous exhaustion, the authorities will conclude that guilt over his employer's death drove the poor secretary to cardiac arrest. Holmes chose this moment to step from concealment, his revolver leveled steadily at the professor's chest. "I think not, Professor Morstan," he declared with icy calm. "Your campaign of vengeance ends tonight, along with your remarkable telephonic deceptions." Morstan whirled with surprising agility, his hand darting toward the walking stick before freezing at Holmes's sharp warning. The silver head bore modifications that suggested concealed mechanisms of a decidedly lethal nature. After a moment's tense silence, the professor's lips curved into a thin smile of recognition. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he said, his voice recovering its academic composure with remarkable speed. "Your reputation for interference in matters beyond your comprehension is well established. However, I believe you will find that my actions, while perhaps unconventional, serve a higher justice than your pedestrian legal codes can encompass." Holmes gestured for me to secure the walking stick, while maintaining his own weapons-deadly focus. "Justice, Professor. You speak of justice while planning the cold-blooded murder of an innocent young man whose only crime was falling victim to your manipulation. Your grievance against Pemberton, however legitimate it may have been, died with him. What remains is simple murder, dressed in the robes of righteousness." The mask of civility dropped away, revealing the consuming hatred beneath. "Pemberton destroyed me, Holmes. My research into telephonic transmission was years ahead of its time, but he convinced the Royal Institution that my results were fabricated. He branded me a fraud before the entire scientific community, reducing decades of brilliant work to nothing more than a charlatan's trickery." "And so you devoted your considerable talents to proving him correct," Holmes replied with cutting precision. "You became exactly what he accused you of being, a fraud who uses scientific knowledge not for advancement but for deception and murder. How many hours did you spend recording Pemberton's conversations, studying his speech patterns like a common mimic?" Morstan's hands trembled with barely suppressed fury, yet his eyes retained the calculating intelligence that had conceived such an elaborate scheme. "You understand nothing of what was taken from me. The apparatus you see before you represents innovations that would revolutionize communication, yet I can never claim credit for them. Pemberton ensured that any discovery bearing my name would be dismissed as fraudulent." Holmes moved closer, his grey eyes boring into Morstan's with relentless intensity. "Then why not publish your work under a pseudonym? Why not allow your innovations to speak for themselves? Because revenge consumed you more completely than ambition ever did. You chose to use your genius for destruction rather than creation, and in doing so validated every accusation Pemberton made against your character." The professor's shoulders sagged slightly as the psychological thrust struck home, yet his gaze remained defiant. Around us, the elaborate telephonic apparatus hummed with malevolent potential, its wires and batteries representing not scientific progress, but the instruments of a brilliant mind's corruption. The confrontation had reached its crucial moment, with justice and vengeance balanced on the razor's edge of Holmes's unwavering determination to see truth prevail over the seductive appeal of intellectual superiority turned to evil purpose. The psychological blow Holmes had delivered seemed to penetrate the professor's carefully constructed armor of righteous indignation, yet, rather than surrender, it appeared to steel his resolve with desperate determination. His eyes, which had burned with intellectual superiority moments before, now flickered between calculation and something approaching panic. The apparatus around us hummed with malevolent potential, its wires and batteries representing not merely the instruments of deception, but the physical manifestation of a brilliant mind's complete corruption. "You speak of validation and character, Mr. Holmes," Morstan said slowly, his voice struggling to maintain its academic precision, even as his hands trembled with barely suppressed emotion. "Yet you fail to comprehend the essential nature of the injustice perpetrated against me. Pemberton's testimony before the Royal Institution was itself a fabrication based upon his deliberate misrepresentation of my experimental methods. He destroyed me not from scientific principle but from commercial rivalry, for my research into telephonic transmission threatened the substantial investments he had made in conventional telegraph companies. Holmes maintained his unwavering guard while allowing his grey eyes to show a flicker of interest. This was the moment he had been maneuvering toward, the point where intellectual pride would compel full confession. Then you admit that your elaborate scheme was designed not merely to kill Pemberton, but to destroy his reputation posthumously while simultaneously discrediting all those associated with his firm. "Precisely," Morstan replied, his mask of civility finally slipping away entirely. "The apparatus you see before you represents innovations that could revolutionize communication throughout the empire. The ability to record, store, and retransmit human speech with perfect fidelity opens possibilities that current technology cannot approach. Yet I can never claim credit, never publish, never receive recognition for achievements that surpass anything Bell or Edison have accomplished." He gestured toward the array of wax cylinders with bitter pride. Those recordings contain not only Pemberton's voice, captured during legitimate business calls over the past 6 months, but also conversations that reveal the full extent of his commercial manipulations. I documented everything, intending to use the evidence to destroy his reputation as thoroughly as he had destroyed mine. Holmes pressed his advantage with surgical precision, yet you did not merely expose his corruption through legitimate channels, you chose instead to become exactly what he accused you of being, a fraud who uses scientific knowledge for deception and murder. How many hours did you spend studying his speech patterns, Professor, arranging and rearranging his recorded words like a composer creating a symphony of lies? The accusation struck home with devastating effect. Morstan's shoulders sagged as years of consuming hatred warred against the remnants of his scientific integrity. "The phantom call to Sir Edmund was not improvised," he admitted, with evident reluctance. "I spent weeks perfecting the technique, learning to splice together fragments of recorded speech so seamlessly that even intimate friends would detect no artifice." The conversation about the financial transfer never took place as Sir Edmund heard it, yet every word was genuinely Pemberton's voice. I found myself simultaneously repelled and fascinated by the technical audacity of the deception. "But Holmes," I interjected, "how could such a reconstruction fool someone who knew Pemberton intimately?" Holmes answered without taking his eyes from our prisoner. "Because, Watson, the human mind is the most easily manipulated instrument of all. Sir Edmund, shocked by his friend's sudden death and desperate for some final connection, unconsciously collaborated in the deception. The professor needed only to provide the expected cues, familiar greetings, standard business phrases, appropriate farewells, and Sir Edmund's grief-stricken mind filled in the gaps, interpreting mechanical pauses as natural conversation rhythms. Morstan nodded with grudging respect for Holmes's deduction. The technique relies upon the listener's emotional investment in believing what they hear. I merely provided a framework. Sir Edmund's own memories and expectations completed the illusion. It was, in essence, a séance conducted not with spirits, but with electricity and wax. "And Pemberton himself?" Holmes inquired with deadly quiet. "You spoke of his heart condition as though his death were natural, yet I suspect the truth is considerably more sinister." The professor's face contorted with a mixture of pride and something darker. "Harold Pemberton died of his own weakness," he said slowly, savouring each word. Years of anxiety and overwork had weakened his constitution considerably. All that was required was a carefully calculated shock, delivered at the precise moment when he was alone and vulnerable in his study. Holmes's eyes blazed with sudden understanding. "You used this very apparatus to confront him directly, speaking through the wiretap connection while he sat at his desk, not as a phantom voice for others to hear later, but as an immediate psychological assault designed to trigger the cardiac episode that killed him." "He believed himself secure in his locked study," Morstan confirmed with cold satisfaction. Then the telephone, that instrument which had carried so many of his judgments and condemnations, spoke back to him with voices he thought forever silenced. I reminded him of that tribunal at the institution, of the accusations he had levelled against my character. I suggested that the world was about to learn that the real fraud had never been the professor, but the financier whose testimony had destroyed an innocent man. The full scope of the revenge plot was now revealed in all its calculated malevolence. Holmes lowered his revolver slightly, though his vigilance remained absolute. A man whose entire existence rested upon public confidence could not endure such a prospect. When his heart failed under the psychological assault, you were ready with your elaborate posthumous performance, designed to extend that same ruin to everyone who had stood beside him. "Exactly," Morstan replied with the satisfaction of a lecturer pleased by an apt pupil. "Vance to bear the blame for the telephonic deception, Fenton to be suspected of financial fraud, through the obsolete authorization code Julian Pemberton to be implicated by planted evidence. Sir Edmund's reputation would be questioned, the firm shaken to its foundations. Each would taste what I had endured, doubt, suspicion, the gradual withdrawal of society's respect." Holmes's expression hardened as he contemplated the scope of the planned destruction. "And you would have stood aside to observe their suffering from a safe distance, having transformed your legitimate grievances into an instrument of wholesale vengeance. Yet you made one crucial miscalculation, Professor Morstan." The sudden shift in Holmes's tone caused Morstan's eyes to narrow with alarm. "What miscalculation?" "You assumed that young Vance would remain your obedient instrument indefinitely. Instead, his conscience began to trouble him, leading to indiscretions that brought your entire scheme to my attention. The notebook he entrusted to Miss Sutherland, containing your technical diagrams and correspondence, is now in my possession. More significantly, your plan to eliminate him with aconitine has been exposed before you could implement it." For the first time, genuine fear flickered across Morstan's features as he realized the full extent of his exposure. His gaze darted toward the vial of poison, then to the complex apparatus that represented both his genius and his downfall. The moment of final decision was approaching, and I could see in his eyes the desperate calculation of a cornered predator weighing his remaining options. The confrontation had reached its crucial juncture, with all the elements of this extraordinary case finally laid bare between us. Yet I sensed that Holmes had not yet revealed all his cards, and that the true climax of our investigation still awaited us in the shadows of this fog-shrouded London night. The desperate calculation in Morstan's eyes crystallized into violent action as his hand shot toward the main electrical switch of his apparatus. Before Holmes or I could react, he threw the lever with savage force, sending a massive surge through the overloaded batteries. The room erupted in blinding blue-white light, accompanied by a thunderous crack that shook the very foundations of the house. Sparks cascaded across the workbench as glass retorts exploded, filling the air with the acrid stench of ozone and burning insulation. Holmes had anticipated this final gambit with characteristic prescience. Even as the electrical explosion illuminated the room like daylight, he hurled himself forward, seizing Morstan by the collar before the professor could complete his destructive work. The two men struggled briefly among the smoking ruins of the apparatus, but years of sedentary academic life had left Morstan no match for Holmes's wiry strength and practiced skill. Within moments, the disgraced scientist was pinned against his own workbench, his face pressed into the tangle of wires that had been the instruments of his vengeance. "You have won this engagement, Mr. Holmes," Morstan gasped, his cultured voice ragged with defeat. "Yet you cannot undo what has already been set in motion. Even now young Vance lies dying in his lodgings, the aconitine coursing through his veins. I administered it this afternoon, disguised in celebratory brandy, to mark our enterprise's completion." Holmes's grey eyes showed no flicker of the anticipated shock. Instead, his thin lips curved into that enigmatic smile I had learned to recognize as the prelude to his most devastating revelations. "You refer to the brandy you left at 3 o'clock this afternoon, accompanied by a congratulatory note in your distinctive hand. The same brandy I removed and replaced with harmless substitute 2 hours later, having deduced your intentions from Miss Sutherland's information." The colour drained from Morstan's face as the implications became clear. "Impossible," he whispered, though his voice carried the hollow ring of a man confronting absolute defeat. "On the contrary, Professor, your methods were entirely predictable to one familiar with criminal psychology. The notebook contained observations of Vance's habits, including his weakness for fine brandy. Your correspondence revealed your intention to eliminate witnesses, and your aconitine purchase was confirmed through pharmaceutical records I examined this morning." Holmes produced his police whistle, its shrill blast bringing the immediate thunder of boots on pavement. Inspector Lestrade and his constables converged upon our position, the Scotland Yard inspector's weathered face showing satisfaction at finding his quarry subdued. As handcuffs closed around Morstan's wrists, the professor's eyes met Holmes's with a mixture of hatred and grudging respect. "You have prevented immediate injustice, Mr. Holmes," he said, with the last remnants of his academic dignity. "Yet you cannot restore what Pemberton took from me. My name remains synonymous with fraud, my research discredited." Holmes regarded him with an expression that might have contained sympathy had it not been tempered by absolute moral clarity. "The injustice you suffered was real, Professor Morstan, yet you chose to compound it rather than transcend it. Had you rebuilt your reputation through legitimate channels rather than destroying others through illegitimate ones, you might have achieved the recognition you craved." The following evening found us in the familiar comfort of our Baker Street sitting room, a roaring fire chasing away the lingering chill of fog. Sir Edmund sat opposite us, his face clear of the haunted look that had plagued him since that first impossible telephone call. Holmes, settled deep in his armchair with his pipe drawing well, was in that philosophical mood that often followed his periods of intense exertion. The case hinged upon distinguishing between the probable and the possible, Holmes remarked, gazing into the flames. When you presented an impossibility, a dead man making a telephone call, we were left with two possibilities. Either you were mad, or you were the victim of sophisticated deception. The physical evidence pointed instantly to the latter. He leaned forward, emphasizing his points with precise gestures. The true complexity lay in the duality of clues. We found evidence pointing to Vance, the billiard chalk, the burned correspondence, the Turkish cigarette. But we also discovered traces of a more sophisticated mind, the face powder residue, the advanced wiring, the obsolete authorization code. The chemical distinction between calcium carbonate and zinc oxide became the pivot upon which the entire investigation turned. Morstan's plan was a masterpiece of malevolence, Holmes continued. He wished not merely to steal, but to orchestrate a tragedy, destroying everyone connected to Pemberton. Using spliced recordings of your friend's voice, he created a ghost that could testify against the living. He knew the human mind seeks patterns and that your desperate desire to hear Pemberton one last time would smooth over any mechanical imperfections. Sir Edmund rose, his expression showing profound gratitude. "You have saved more than my life, Mr. Holmes. You have preserved my honor and my friend's memory." After our guest departed, Holmes moved to the window, watching fog swirl against the glass. The manic energy of the chase had faded, replaced by melancholy stillness. "A remarkable mind warped by grievance until it consumed itself," he murmured. Morstan possessed the intellect to illuminate the world, yet chose to deepen the darkness. When genius turns to crime, Watson, it leaves a void no amount of justice can fill. He turned back, picking up his violin. But the phantom voice is silenced forever. I think a little buck would be the appropriate antidote to the mechanics of human vengeance. As the first clear notes filled the room, the case of the night, the dead man, made a call, passed from terrifying mystery into the quiet archives of our extraordinary partnership. 3 weeks had passed since Professor Morstan's dramatic arrest, and London had begun to settle back into its familiar rhythms. The yellow fog that had shrouded our investigation had given way to crisp December mornings, and Holmes had returned to his customary routine of chemical experiments and violin practice. Yet I could see in his occasional distant gaze that the case continued to occupy his thoughts, as it did my own. The trial of Professor Edmund Morstan proved to be the sensation of the season. The Central Criminal Court was packed daily with spectators drawn by the extraordinary nature of the charges: murder by telephonic deception, conspiracy to defraud, and attempted poisoning. Holmes testified with characteristic precision, explaining to the fascinated jury how the phantom voice had been created through spliced wax cylinder recordings and sophisticated electrical apparatus. When the prosecution played Pemberton's reconstructed voice in court, speaking words he had never actually uttered in that sequence, a visible shudder passed through the assembled crowd. The defense argued passionately that Pemberton's death had resulted from natural causes, triggered by justified confrontation over past wrongs. They painted Morstan as a victim of academic persecution, whose brilliant mind had been driven to desperate measures. Yet when confronted with the evidence of premeditated murder, the aconitine vial, and the elaborate apparatus designed to destroy innocent lives, the jury required only 2 hours to return a verdict of guilty on all charges. Professor Morstan received 20 years of penal servitude, a sentence that would likely encompass his remaining years. As the guards led him from the dock, he cast one final glance toward Holmes, an expression of such complex emotion crossing his features that I could not determine whether it represented hatred, respect, or some amalgamation of both. Justice had been served, yet I sensed my friend took no satisfaction in the sight of such intellectual gifts condemned to waste away in prison. The resolution of the case brought varied fortunes to those caught in Morstan's web of deception. Silas Vance, whose conscience had ultimately saved him from the professor's final solution, received a sentence of 18 months for his role in the conspiracy. Miss Mary Sutherland remained faithful throughout his imprisonment, and I later learned they married shortly after his release, establishing themselves in a quiet, provincial town far from London's financial districts. Young Julian Pemberton, cleared of all suspicion, underwent a remarkable transformation. The shock of his uncle's death and his narrow escape from false accusation seemed to awaken dormant qualities of responsibility and purpose. Under Sir Edmund's guidance, he assumed a position within the firm and began to demonstrate the business acumen his family name suggested. Mr. Archibald Fenton, whose reputation had been so cynically gambled with by Morstan, found himself elevated to partner in the newly constituted firm of Blackwood, Fenton and Company. Sir Edmund insisted upon the change as visible reparation for the ordeal the faithful cashier had endured. The obsolete authorization code that was meant to destroy him instead became the instrument of his vindication. One foggy evening, as we sat before our fire discussing the case's final mysteries, Holmes provided the technical explanations that completed our understanding. The Turkish cigarette found in the library, he revealed, had been placed there by Morstan during one of his clandestine visits to install the wire-tapping apparatus. The professor had employed theatrical cosmetics containing zinc oxide and rice starch to disguise himself as a workman, accounting for the face powder residue on the telephone receiver. The cigarette had been lit and allowed to burn out naturally using tweezers, creating ash formation consistent with abandonment rather than smoking, thus implicating Julian without requiring Morstan's actual presence during the crucial hours. The most insidious aspect of Morstan's scheme, Holmes reflected, was not its technical sophistication, but its psychological cunning. He understood that grief makes us vulnerable to deception, that we desperately wish to believe in impossible connections with those we have lost. Sir Edmund's mind, shocked by his friend's sudden death, unconsciously collaborated in the illusion, filling gaps in the mechanical reproduction with his own memories and expectations. He rose and moved to the mantelpiece, where he had placed one of Morstan's wax cylinders as a memento of the case. After a moment's contemplation, he tossed it into the fire, where it hissed and melted, the grooves containing Pemberton's voice dissolving into nothingness. The dead should rest in peace, Watson, their voices preserved only in the loving memories of those who knew them, not trapped in wax to be manipulated by the vengeful. He reached for his violin, tucking it beneath his chin. We have witnessed the birth of a new form of crime, one that employs science not for humanity's benefit, but for its deception. Morstan possessed the intellect to illuminate the world, yet chose instead to deepen its shadows. That, perhaps, is the greatest tragedy of all. As the first melancholic notes filled our sitting room, I reflected that we had solved more than a murder mystery. We had confronted the dark potential of human genius when corrupted by grievance, and witnessed both its terrible power and its ultimate futility against the patient application of reason and justice. The phantom voice was silenced forever, but its lesson would echo through our future investigations, a reminder that the most dangerous criminals are often those blessed with the greatest gifts, who choose to employ them not for creation, but for destruction. The case of the night the dead man made a call thus passed into the chronicles of our partnership, not merely as another triumph of deductive reasoning, but as a meditation on the eternal struggle between the forces that elevate humanity and those that would drag it down into darkness.